Okay, we have chapter 16, A Strange Sense of Joy, on page 169, and Amy Carmichael. It was 3 o'clock in the morning on May 10th, 1909. Amy sat quietly under a banyan tree. She was partly hidden in the shadows. That was the way she wanted it. She could see about a mile down the moonlit road, but no one could see her. She was waiting for someone she hoped could help her. It had all started 2 months earlier when a young girl and her mother came rushing up the steps of the bungalow, yelling for refuge. Amy sat down and poured cups of steaming tea while the mother told her story. Her 12-year-old daughter, Mutamal, was her only child. Mutamal's father had recently died and left all his possessions, including several thousand rupees worth of land, to her. That is where the trouble had started. Mutamal was now a very rich girl, and for her father's family, the most important task was to keep her land and wealth in the family. This, they decided, would be easy. All they had to do was marry Mutamal off to one of her father's relatives. An old man, a distant cousin of Mutamal's father, who had no wife at the time, was chosen to be her husband and so secure the family's wealth. Mutamal's mother told Amy she was horrified at the thought of her daughter being married off to someone old enough to be her grandfather, and she had escaped to Dohnavur with her daughter. Amy immediately offered to look after Mutamal, and her mother disappeared as quickly as she'd arrived. When her mother was gone, Mutamal finally found her voice. "Promise me, whatever happens, you will not make me leave here," she begged Amy. Amy tried to be as reassuring as possible, though she knew there had been times when the Dohnavur family had been ordered by the court to give up girls, and they had done as directed. "I can't promise you that, but we'll do our best," she told Mutamal. The answer was not good enough for Mutamal. 4 years before, she had heard of Dohnavur and the Christian God and how he answered prayer. "But I have heard that your God answers prayer. Won't he answer the prayer of a little girl?" she asked. "Let's pray together and see what happens," Amy answered. Meanwhile, Amy had found out more about Mutamal's mother, who was not the kind, caring woman she had pretended to be. In fact, she was as greedy as her husband's family. She did not want Mutamal to marry the old man because she was looking for a way to keep Mutamal's money for herself. She was looking for a way to keep Mutamal's money for herself, so it wouldn't go to the husband. Okay. Amy was sickened by the way both the mother and the father's family viewed Mutamal as a way to get rich. Amy had grown to love Mutamal, and she felt she deserved to live with people who cared about her. Walker had been away when Mutamal arrived, but as soon as he returned, Amy filled him in on the details. Because Mutamal had been left at Dohnavur by her mother. Stop brushing your hair. Sorry, I feared that all you could hear was the brushing of hair, so I told her to stop brushing her hair. Now I lost the place where I was. Walker had been away when Mutamal arrived, but as soon as he returned, Amy filled him in on the details. Because Mutamal had been left at Dohnavur by her mother to keep her out of the reach of the father's family, Walker had a bad feeling about the situation. To protect themselves legally, he urged Amy to speak with the local magistrate and seek his advice. Amy did so the next day, and the magistrate told her she should return Mutamal to her mother immediately. Amy didn't know what to do, but she did not believe in breaking the law. She decided to wait a day before returning Mutamal to her mother in hope some legal way to keep her might be found. She prayed for a solution, even a miracle, through the night, but in the morning, things were exactly as they had been the night before, and Mutamal had to be returned to her mother. That is what had led Amy to be under the banyan tree at 3 o'clock in the morning. She'd heard that a high court official might be passing through on a journey early in the morning. Sure enough, at 4 a.m., Amy heard the rumbling of a bandy in the distance. She stood and waited for it to come near. When it was close enough, she darted out of the shadows and flagged it down. The English official riding inside was astonished to see a single white woman in a sari running out to greet him, especially at 4 in the morning. However, he stopped and accepted Amy's unusual invitation to have a cup of tea. and a sandwich. As the official sat under the tree eating his sandwich and drinking his tea, Amy told him the story of Mutamal and how both sides of her family were fighting over the custody to gain control of her inheritance. The official listened and nodded sympathetically, or raised his eyebrows or shook his head at all the right moments. Amy felt sure he understood. But then he told her the bad news. He was sorry, but there was nothing he could do. India had its own strange and mysterious ways, and it was not British Empire policy to interfere with matters of religion or local custom, no matter how unacceptable they seemed to the English. Amy thanked him, and after he'd proceeded on with his journey, she wearily packed up her teapot and china cups into a basket and walked back to the bungalow in Dohnavur. As she walked past paddy fields and sleeping bullocks, she tried to think of a solution. Mutamal had such a simple faith in God. Amy was sure something would happen to save her from her terrible circumstances, and something did happen. Though it was not what Amy had in mind, Mutamal was kidnapped by her father's brothers. Of course, this made her mother very angry, and she went straight to the court to get her daughter back. Eventually, the judge ordered Amy to look after Mutamal at Dohnavur until it was decided which side of the family should get her. There were two conditions to this temporary custody. First, Amy had to promise that Mutamal would not change her religion, which to a Hindu meant she would not be baptized. And second, Mutamal had to keep caste. The second condition was more difficult to keep than the first. Mutamal was from a high caste and could not eat food cooked by someone of a lower caste, or even eat in the presence of a lower caste person. But if you're lower caste, wouldn't you like the servant? So your food, it's so confusing. How do you keep track of all this caste thing? Oh. This meant that she had to prepare and eat all her own food alone in a tiny room. It was an inconvenience for everyone, but Amy tried hard to help Mutamal stick to an agreement with the court. Mutamal begged Amy to be allowed to stay at the Dohnavur for good. Finally, Amy agreed. Someone had to speak up for the child. Amy didn't know how, but she would find some way to gain permanent custody of Mutamal. She would need a good lawyer, though, and good lawyers were very expensive, but Amy managed to find one she could afford. A Christian lawyer from Madras offered to take on Mutamal's case for free. Amy and her lawyer quickly filed for custody, and while court hearings were being continually delayed, Amy and the family grew to love Mutamal even more. Mutamal fit in easily, and although she knew she couldn't be baptized, she became a Christian in her heart. Time dragged on. Amy kept Mutamal with her nearly all the time. I'm sorry, it's like 10:30 at night. She realized that if the Dohnavur family let down their guard for a moment, Mutamal could easily be kidnapped again. All her father's family needed to do was tie a marriage jewel onto her, and it would be too late. She would be officially married to the old man. As the court case dragged on, it became more and more complicated, more and more costly, and more stressful for Amy. She longed for it all to be over. Mutamal's court case was not the only thing on Amy's mind. The family at Dohnavur was growing rapidly. Amy was now Amma to more than 100 girls. This meant that more staff were needed, and Amy was thankful when Frances Bath, an Australian missionary, joined the family. There was also a constant stream of visitors to Dohnavur. It seemed people were reading things as they are and decided to come to India to see Amy's work for themselves. One person who was visiting at the time was Mabel Bath, Frances' sister. Amy welcomed her as she welcomed everyone who came to visit. She put Mabel straight to work. Finally, after much delay, March 27, 1911 was set as the day the custody trial would be settled. On the night before, Ira Walker escorted Amy to Palamakata, where the verdict was to be read. Amy prayed that God would somehow make a way for Mutamal to stay with them. Mutamal herself had stayed behind in Dohnavur with Panamal. Although Mutamal was still safe with the family, Amy knew that if the judge ordered Mutamal to be handed over to her mother or her father's family, she would have to obey his order. As she entered the courtroom, she thought about 2 nights before when she had stayed up all night talking with Mutamal. Amy had hoped to encourage her, but just the opposite had happened. Mutamal had such a strong faith in God and a trust that things would work out that she had encouraged Amy. Isn't that how it should be? The courtroom was sweltering as the clerk read the judge's verdict. Page after page of elaborately phrased summary was read. I'm sorry again. Amy heard the news she had dreaded for nearly 2 years. Mutamal was to go back to her mother, and Amy had to pay all of her mother's legal expenses for the trial. Mutamal was to be handed over to her mother on April 4th. It should have been a moment of complete defeat for Amy, but somehow it wasn't. Amy felt a strange sense of joy, and somewhere deep inside she knew that everything was going to work out. I bet you Mutamal is going to share Jesus with her mom, and then everything will be honky-dory. Amy's lawyer thought she would appeal the verdict immediately, and so without much enthusiasm for yet another round of court cases, Amy agreed to go to Madras to meet with the lawyer yet again. What happened there? The night before Amy was due to catch the train from Palamakata to Madras, she received a message from Ira Walker, who had returned to Dohnavur. The message made her trip to Madras unnecessary. It read, "When I returned home on Thursday morning, it was reported to me that Mutamal had disappeared." Oh, she ran away. Amy was stunned. Conflicting thoughts rushed through her mind. Had Mutamal been kidnapped by her father's family? Was she already married? Had she run away? Had someone in the Dohnavur family helped her? And what did this mean for Amy and the rest of the girls? The judge was sure to think that Amy had arranged for Mutamal to go into hiding. He could find her in contempt of court and throw her in jail. That could mean the end of the Dohnavur family. Amy hurried back to Dohnavur as fast as she could to find out what happened to Mutamal. She questioned everyone, but no one seemed to know anything about her disappearance. Panamal had seen her go to bed in the evening, but when Mutamal didn't show up for her chores the following morning, Frances Beath had gone to find her. But Mutamal wasn't in her room, and not a single thing of hers had been taken or disturbed. Her bedroll was unwrapped, which suggested she had slept there. Beyond that, Amy could learn nothing more. She was sure no one was lying to her. But she was also sure Mutamal couldn't have disappeared the way she did on her own. It was a mystery. Amy had plenty of other things besides the mystery to think about. Many people had followed the case of Mutamal, and now that the girl was missing, there was a public outcry against Amy and her work. Amy turned to another English lawyer to review the case for her. His advice to Amy was to the point. "I advise you to disappear with all your children and cover your tracks. If you cannot do that, I do not know what else you could do to save them all, except faith." Amy shuddered. She had spoken up for Mutamal, and now she was in danger of losing her whole family and ending up in a Madras jail. Yet she couldn't forget the feeling of joy that had flooded her when she heard the verdict. Somehow she knew that God would work things out. As it was, she had no other choice but to hold on to her faith. There was no way an English Amma and more than 100 girls could hide themselves anywhere in India, even if they wanted to. Amy and the family prayed about the situation every day. They prayed for Mutamal. They asked that she would be kept safe wherever she was, and safe and they prayed that no court case would be filed against Amy because Mutamal's disappearance, and none was filed. Once Mutamal was gone, her father's family and her mother seemed to lose interest in her, and the whole matter of where she had gone or who had taken her was forgotten. Amy supposed that the families were too busy fighting over the inheritance Mutamal had left behind to care about where she might be. Amy was still left with a huge legal bill, though her own lawyer had donated his time, but Mutamal's mother lawyer had cost a great deal of money Amy didn't have. The last thing Amy needed was to be held in contempt of court for refusing to pay the mother's legal bills, in addition to losing Mutamal. Just in the nick of time, an anonymous donation arrived at Dohnavur that would cover the legal bills. It was the exact amount needed, right down to the last rupee. Amy was delighted. She knew that God still had his hand on the whole situation. It was not until October 1911, 7 long months after that Amy received a letter postmarked from Guangxi province in China. Amy tore the envelope open and began to read. The letter was written in Mutamal's neat handwriting and told her an almost unbelievable story. The night they had heard the judge's verdict, Mutamal had gone to bed as usual. During the night, she had been awakened by Mabel Baith, the visiting sister of Francis. Mabel had taken Mutamal to her room and dressed her as a Muslim boy. Then Mabel had taken her outside the compound and told her to wait. Soon after, a bullock cart lumbered by, and Mutamal was beckoned to climb aboard. Not knowing what else to do, she had obeyed. The driver of the bullock cart turned out to be a Christian from a nearby mission. He had handed Mutamal to another Christian, and so it had gone, passing from one Christian to another, until she arrived in Colombo, Ceylon. There, an Englishman escorted her to Malaya, Singapore, and then to Hong Kong. From there, they traveled by junk 600 miles up the West River to the town of Nanning in Guangxi province. In Nanning, Mutamal was delivered to the home of an American missionary couple, Dr. and Mrs. Clift, with whom Mutamal was finally safe and happy. Amy laid down the letter and smiled. Joy flooded over her with the knowledge that her daughter was safe. She wiped the tears of joy from her eyes as she tried to imagine all the Christian strangers who had spent time and money to escort a girl they had never met before on an amazing journey. She thanked God for her faithfully watching over one young Indian girl who had put her faith in him. Amy tucked the letter into her sari and went to find Ira Walker, who had been there to support her through all the ups and downs of the custody case. She wanted him to be the first to know that good news about Mutamal. Amy would not have Ira Walker to lean on for much longer. In August 1912, he was preaching in a series of meetings in Masulipatam. On August 24th, Amy received 2 telegrams. The first, which had been delayed for 2 days, said that Thomas Ira Walker was dangerously ill. The second bore the message, Revelations 22:4. Amy reached for her worn Bible and flipped to the last page. She scanned down to the verse, and his servants shall serve him, and they shall see his face. Amy sat for a long time after reading the verse. It could mean only one thing. Her dear friend, who had taught her the Tamil language and supported her through all the trials and tribulations of starting the Starry Cluster, and then the family of Dohnavur, was dead. He was 52 years old when he died, and the news of his death left Amy in a daze. It was so difficult to believe that a healthy man who had left just a week before was dead. As the week went on, Amy heard that Ira Walker had died of food poisoning. She also had the heartbreaking task of contacting his wife, who was back in England and still very sick. For a few days, it seemed as though grief might overcome Amy. Ira Walker had been like a big brother to her, and news of his death had come several weeks after news of the death of her other special friend in India, Mrs. Hopwood in Ooty. Amy had always gathered a team around her for support and encouragement, but now she was on her own. How would she cope without these special people? The women who worked with Amy were concerned for her. Ponnamal tried to help. "It is very difficult to see how this is for the best," she told Amy. Amy replied, "It is not difficult to see how this is for the best. It is impossible, but we are asked to walk not by sight, but by faith. And only faith can allow us to let Ira Walker go without bitterness." Amy prayed for the strength to go on, and within days of Ira Walker's death, 2 new helpers arrived to work alongside her. While they could never fill the gap left by Ira Walker, they were very helpful. They were 2 sisters, Edith and Agnes Nash, who had both been missionaries in India for many years. As soon as they had heard of Ira Walker's death, they had given up their own plans and rushed to help Amy. Both sisters fit into the family perfectly, and Agnes Nash relieved Amy of the huge burden of running the school for the girls. Arul Dasan, Arulai's cousin, who as a boy had been beaten for listening to the gospel message, had been Ira Walker's assistant for many years. Following Ira Walker's death, Arul Dasan offered to help Amy in any way he could. With enormous relief, Amy gladly handed over charge of all the building work to him. This involved Arul Dasan supervising the maintenance of the existing buildings and planning the new ones. The family was still growing fast, and 140 people were now living with the family, so there was always some kind of building in progress. Within a year of Ira Walker's death, Ponnamal became sick, and Amy took her to Nagercoil for treatment. It turned out she had cancer, and 2 operations were performed to try to get rid of it. Amy stayed with Ponnamal for 2 months while she recovered. Finally, the doctor said that Ponnamal was well enough to make the journey back to Dohnavur. This is a long chapter. Soon after arriving back to Dohnavur, Amy received more bad news. On July 14, 1913, back in England, her mother had died. Again, Amy stopped to mourn, but the Dohnavur family was still growing, and Amy threw herself into the work, trying to forget all the tragedy that had surrounded her during the previous year. But it wasn't long before another shadow fell. Ponnamal's cancer returned, and on August 26, 1915, she too died and was buried in God's garden at Dohnavur. It was a difficult and lonely time for Amy. Ponnamal had been with her from the beginning of the starry cluster. She was the one Amy had left in charge of the family when she was away, and just as she had with Ira Walker, she had come to rely on Ponnamal. But now Ponnamal was no longer there, and just as it had been for her after Ira Walker's death, Amy had to rely on her faith to go on without bitterness. As before, Amy threw herself into the work, and the joy began being Amma to so many happy children, rescued from Hindu temples and other desperate situations, soon helped Amy to press on after the deaths of so many of the people close to her. Sometimes Amy had dreams that she learned to pay attention to. In one of her dreams, she had seen Mutamal and Arul Dasan being married in a wedding ceremony in Ceylon. The dream was very vivid, filled with little details, like their being married in Galley Face Church in Colombo, and neither Amy nor the Cliffs being present. Amy didn't say anything about it for some time, but finally she shared the dream with Arulai. Much to Amy's surprise, Arulai smiled widely. "I've been praying for Arul Dasan and Mutamal would get married for over a year now," she told Amy with great excitement. Amy asked Arul Dasan what he thought about the idea of marrying Mutamal, and he was very pleased with it. So he and Mutamal began to write to each other, and soon they were engaged. It was thought that Arul Dasan would travel to China for the wedding, but in 1917, the world was at war, and it was unsafe for him to travel all that way. Besides, Dr. and Mrs. Cliff were leaving China, and it seemed more sensible for them to take Mutamal as far as Ceylon. The Cliffs, though, were in a hurry to get home and were unable to wait in Ceylon for Arul Dasan to arrive for the wedding. So Arul Dasan and Mutamal were married in Galley Face Church in Colombo, Ceylon, without the Cliffs or Amy present. Just as Amy had dreamed, the newlyweds returned to Dohnavur and set up a home in the compound where they served together for the rest of their lives. Of course, Amy had a wonderful reunion with Mutimal and Richard. Oh, I wasn't expecting that.